The first thing I learned on a world of giant women was how to measure time without clocks. You counted heartbeats between footsteps, calculated survival in the length of a shadow sliding across metal flooring, learned that, when the ground hummed softly, it meant someone important was walking nearby, and you should stop breathing just to be polite. The giants called this place a labor habitat. I called it a very expensive ant farm, except the ants had names and opinions and occasionally sarcasm, which I kept strictly internal for health reasons. Above me, towers curved like sculpted bones, built to fit bodies that could lean on mountains the way I leaned on a wall. The women who ruled here were enormous beyond logic, their long limbs moving with deliberate grace, their faces striking and severe, beauty amplified by scale until it felt almost unfair, like being judged by a goddess for wearing mismatched socks. They owned everything, including me, though ownership was spoken of the way other civilizations spoke of weather: unavoidable, neutral, not worth emotional investment. I worked where they pointed, carried what I could, and endured the rest. Anti-grav fields kept the atmosphere breathable for someone my size, though the side effect was that my hair floated constantly, giving me the dignified look of a startled dandelion. The giantess assigned to oversee my section would sometimes crouch nearby, her eye alone larger than my entire torso, watching with academic calm, as if waiting to see whether I would break or sprout wings. Once she asked if the work was adequate. I said yes, because the alternative seemed impolite. At night, when the lights dimmed to accommodate their circadian rhythms, I lay in my containment alcove listening to the distant hum of planetary shields and the much closer sound of laughter echoing through corridors never designed for small ears. I told jokes to myself, quiet ones, about freedom and scale and how ironic it was that, on a world this big, everything felt so tightly held. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere far above, those towering women were beginning to notice that the smallest thing they owned was also the one thing they couldn't quite control. By the third year, the work changed. Not lighter, not kinder, just stranger. I was no longer moved from station to station like a piece of equipment with legs. Instead, I was kept where I was and observed. Sensors bloomed from the walls like metallic flowers, tracking my movements, my pulse, the way my shoulders tensed whenever the floor vibrated. I joked to myself that I had been promoted from labor unit to very small documentary subject. Somewhere, I imagined a giant woman narrating my life in a calm voice. Here we see the human attempting rest despite knowing a footstep could rewrite geography. The giantess who watched me most often began visiting without pretense. She would lower herself to a crouch that still made the ceiling groan and rest her chin on two fingers, studying me with eyes that reflected data streams and distant stars. Her features were long and elegant, shaped by a scale that made every expression feel deliberate, almost ceremonial. Once, she tried to sit closer and misjudged the distance. The resulting tremor knocked me flat, and she froze, horrified, apologizing in a voice that rattled my bones. I waved from the floor and told her I survived worse furniture. That earned a sound I later realized was laughter. They asked questions then, not commands, questions. How did I endure the noise? Did the silence ever feel louder? What did I think of their world? I answered carefully, with humor wrapped around honesty like insulation around a live wire. I told them their cities were beautiful but very unfriendly to ankles. I said their sky was impressive but made me nervous, like it might fall. The giantess listened, truly listened, and I saw something shift behind her immense composure. At night, new dreams came. Not of escape, but of standing in the open while towering silhouettes debated ideas instead of ownership. I woke to the soft glow of alien constellations and realized something unsettling. They were studying me not to improve control, but to understand why it wasn't working anymore. The offer arrived on a day that felt aggressively ordinary, which in hindsight should have worried me more. I was recalibrating a gravity conduit, very slowly, because Rushing on this planet was how continents got redecorated. When the lights shifted to ceremonial blue, that color usually meant a proclamation, or an execution, or a very important announcement about grain quotas. Instead, the giantess descended into view wearing formal regalia, her towering form framed by hovering holograms that adjusted scale so I wouldn't immediately feel like an insect at a judgment hearing. I appreciated the effort. It's nice when someone tries not to terrify you before breakfast. She knelt, a motion that sent a ripple through the structure and spoke my designation with unusual care. Not a command, not a summons. An invitation. I almost laughed because being invited by someone who could pick up a city block felt like being politely asked by a tidal wave. She explained that the ruling caste had reached an impasse. Their systems predicted instability. Ownership without compliance produced resistance. Resistance, apparently, was bad for productivity metrics. I nodded like this was all very normal and not a philosophical crisis delivered by a woman taller than most weather patterns. They wanted to grant me freedom. The word landed strangely like a foreign object my brain didn't have a drawer for yet. But freedom, it turned out, came with a condition. Not labor, not loyalty, choice. A voluntary bond, freely given, publicly acknowledged. I blinked and asked if this was a trick. She admitted it might have been once, but now it was desperation wrapped in tradition. I joked that nothing says cultural collapse like asking your former slave for advice. She made that thunderous laughing sound again, and the translators flagged it as genuine amusement. When she rose, I felt smaller than ever, yet oddly heavier, as if the gravity had shifted inward. I returned to my alcove under artificial stars, listening to the planet breathe through its machines. For the first time in years, no one was watching to see if I would break. They were waiting to see what I would choose, and somehow that felt far more dangerous. I asked for time, which caused a brief panic among the council because apparently no one had ever requested that before. They gave me a full planetary cycle, complete with a personal gravity stabilizer, and an escort drone whose only job was to politely remind giant citizens not to accidentally create new landmarks near me. I spent that time walking places I had only ever been carried past, feeling the ground without flinching, watching towering figures slow their steps when they noticed me. It turns out choice has a sound. It's quieter than fear, but it travels farther. When I returned, I stood alone at the center of a chamber designed for voices that could shake continents. The giantess was there, her presence still overwhelming, still majestic, but no longer absolute. I told them I would accept the bond, not as property or symbol, but as a partner in rebuilding something better. I joked that if they wanted consent, they were going to have to get used to complaints, opinions, and occasional sarcasm. The translators struggled with sarcasm. They flagged it as a cultural hazard. Everyone laughed anyway. The systems changed faster than anyone expected. Ownership protocols were rewritten. Observation became dialogue. The labor habitats opened, not all at once, but enough to prove it wasn't a myth. I was no longer escorted. I was consulted. I learned how to speak to giants without craning my neck, and they learned how to listen without towering over every thought. The giantess still loomed when she stood, but when she sat to talk, the world felt balanced in a way it never had before. On my first night truly free, I lay beneath an open sky, no shields between me and unfamiliar stars. I realized I no longer measured time by footsteps or shadows. I measured it by conversations unfinished and choices yet to be made. I was still small. They were still vast. But somewhere between scale and